Welcome to this week's lecture. This is the final lecture for the course, so I bet some of you are quite excited. Hopefully, some of you are a little bit sad. But in any case, I'm happy to deliver this lecture. One, because I think it's going to bring together everything we've discussed, and two, because I think it's going to consider some topics that are relevant to contemporary events. That's something we haven't done in this class so far. So maybe this lecture might be a way for you to really see how what we've learned in this course can be applicable to everyday events and situations, and important ones at that. So, what I want to do today is go over the reading assigned for this week, and I'm going to tailor it in the context of the pandemic we're facing. So, first, I'm going to explain the way I want to conceive of the pandemic in light of what we've studied in this course. And then I want to go over the main points of the reading that I want to draw out. And then I want to use those main points at the end and come back to the problem or the way I'm formulating the issues surrounding the pandemic and bring it all together at the end. So, we're living in a pandemic right now. And as it stands, many people have died from the coronavirus, and many more people will die from the coronavirus. The reason why the coronavirus is so deadly is because it's highly infectious and because it requires the use of scarce medical equipment and scarce medical personnel in cases where the virus poses a high risk of death. Now, to minimize the number of deaths, the governments, federal, state, various levels, have enacted social distancing policies where these policies require individuals to stay at home, to stay at the so-called stay-at-home orders. Now, the idea is simple. If people stay at home, then few people will contract the virus. And this means that for those people who do contract the virus and face a risk of death, there will be sufficient medical equipment and personnel to save them. That is, the scarcity will be reduced. If we don't enact these stay-at-home orders, the virus spreads rapidly, and then there's not enough medical equipment and personnel to save those who face a high risk of death. But there's a problem with these social distancing policies, however. The problem is that these policies are producing great harms for many, many people in society. Most people aren't allowed to work. They aren't allowed to send their kids anywhere to help with the burden of raising and taking care of their kids. And this means that many people, in order to live and care for themselves and their families, have to spend their savings, if they have any. For those that don't, they have to go into debt. And for others, they're just living a new impoverished life because, for whatever reason, they can't get the help they need. So I think here we have a very interesting philosophical question we can ask. Are the social distancing requirements set by the government morally justified? As I've just said, there's a reason to justify them. The requirements are causing much harm to many. And if you think about it, the harm that these requirements are causing are harm to the poorest in society. People who work in high levels of government, people who work in sectors where they utilize high skills have been able to secure an income. Right? The government's still working, and people who work in sectors with high skills have been able to work remotely. But people with low skill jobs have not been able to work remotely. Add to this fact that people with low skills generally have very little savings. They already have high levels of debt and oftentimes many dependents, whether they be children or old people. So all of this together means that the economic harms that are a result of the social distancing policy affect the poorest in society. And of course, the long-term economic effects of the social distancing policy are going to cause very serious economic destruction. And so we are looking forward to a future where there's not going to be stable employment for a period of time. Prices are going to go higher, and there are going to be costly adjustments that have to be made. So these are some of the reasons why we can ask for a moral justification of the social distancing policies. We're already in around week 5 or 6. The longer we draw this out, the worse it is. Now, the question of justification is made more difficult by the fact that the coronavirus poses differing levels of risk of death to different people in society. So the highest risk of death that the coronavirus poses are to some vulnerable segments in society. These are mainly the elderly and people with underlying medical conditions. Now, for most, the risk of death is not high, so far as we can tell. So it's conceivable that if the social distancing policies were not required, then we could avoid the kinds of economic destruction that I was talking about. But that would mean that we would have more deaths due to the coronavirus. Now, whether we choose to enact these social distancing policies or not, we're going to see a lot more deaths in the future. But the question we have to ask is whether the additional lives we'll save by following these social distancing policies is worth the harms that these social distancing policies will cause. So the question of justification is, do the additional lives saved by the social distancing policies, especially the lives saved by those most vulnerable, does this saving of lives justify the harms imposed on everyone else? So that's the question of moral justification that I want to pose for the pandemic. Notice this is a question of political philosophy, also a question of moral philosophy. Now what I want to do is go through the reading, and although the reading doesn't quite deal with this topic, hopefully you can already see how it's relevant. So the paper, Principles of Allocation for Scarce Medical Interventions, is written by 3 top medical ethicists and medical practitioners, and I think it's a good paper. But what it does is it outlines some moral principles that come into play inside of situations where medical treatments are needed but scarce. So these are situations where there's not enough medical treatments to go around. Now, the moral principles that apply in this context are very similar to the moral principles that we've already discussed in class. They're the same principles, but the benefit of this paper is that it tailors the principles so that they apply in a much better and easier way to the context where there's not enough medical treatments to go around. One important point here is that throughout the pandemic, you hear a lot of policymakers say that what we're going to do or the policies we're going to make are based on facts and based on science. This kind of statement, I think, is misleading. It suggests that the policies are based on considerations that are non-normative, based on purely descriptive considerations. That is, they say these policies are based on science. They're not based on my own personal beliefs, or they're not based on the beliefs of the Republican or Democratic Party. But such statements are completely false. There is no way to make a decision that is free of any kind of values. Every decision you make presupposes some end that you're trying to reach, and the end you want to reach has value. because you could pursue other ends, but the reason you don't is because you value the end you are pursuing. So you shouldn't think that just because policies are based on science or fact-based, that they're not also based on considerations of value, what people think is important. So I just want to point that out up front to suggest that, what we think is important necessarily comes into the decisions we make about what to do during the coronavirus. So this paper is nice because it tells you, look, every decision you make presupposes some values. So we might as well just look at the possible values that are in play here, see which ones are good values, see which ones are not so good values. Now this paper, it takes 4 main moral principles and it points out the pros and cons to them. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through these 4 principles that come into play in context of scarce medical interventions, and then we'll see what's good and what's bad about them. So the first principle is the principle of treating people equally. So morality requires, obviously, that people have an equal standing. And when it comes to the context of scarce medical interventions, we might try to implement this principle in 2 ways. The first way is a lottery system for allocating scarce medical interventions. And you might think that a lottery gives everybody the right equal standing because it gives everybody an equal chance to receive medical interventions. And presumably a lottery can be fairly easy to implement. You have people in an emergency room, give them all numbers, and then you draw a number out of a hat. Something like that. Now, one problem with this view is that I'll say a problem I find with this view is that it seems liable to corruption. Now, the authors say that a lottery system isn't very liable to a corruption, but that just seems kind of false to me. If you have some kind of group of people who are organizing or leading the lottery system, they can be corrupted. So I don't see why a lottery system can be corrupted in the same way voting, ways of counting voting tallies can be corrupted. But in any case, there are more serious problems. That a lottery system ignores other moral considerations that clearly come into play. So, for example, if the lottery allots one person a scarce medical intervention, and we see that medical intervention would allow this person to live 1 month longer life, is it the right thing to do to give the scarce medical treatment to that one person, knowing that they'll live 1 month longer, when somebody else, we could give that same medical intervention to somebody else who would, let's say, have 10 years of life? You can say, well, the person who is going to live a month longer won the lottery, and that's fair. But we still don't think it's right when we have to give out medical treatments to, in a sense, waste it on one person who's only going to live a very shorter life than somebody who will live a much longer life. So that's one main problem with the lottery system. Another way to treat people equally in the distribution of scarce medical resources is to do a first come first served basis. Now, this might be thought to give everyone an equal chance because nobody knows when they're going to get sick and nobody knows when they need a medical intervention. So when you get sick, you just go straight to the hospital. And this seems to be like, well, it's a natural lottery, right? It's just chance that you get sick, and when you go to the hospital, you get services. So everybody is treated fairly by nature, so to speak. But the problem with this system is that in practice, it doesn't end up treating people equally, because when you have a first come first served basis, it's typically those who are wealthy or those who are well off who are able to get access first to the goods and services that need to be dished out. One, they might have more connections and be able to transport more easily to those places where they can get on the list first. Also, there's the possibility for corruption. Um, they can pay the managers of the system to move them to the front of the line, or they can rely on friends to move them to the front of the line. So whenever you have first come, first serve, there's the poorer and the less educated are always going to be at a disadvantage in these kinds of systems. Now, it's important to see that, at least in our treatment of coronavirus cases, first come, first serve is a moral principle that we've been using to guide our allocation of the scarce medical resources in this case. Mainly because the people seeking medical treatment for coronavirus problems are in emergency situations, and emergency rooms are run on a first come, first serve basis, or at least that's an important principle. Now, if you don't have a problem of scarcity, if you have enough medical equipment and personnel to treat everybody, first come, first serve is not too much of a problem. But in a pandemic, where many people are contracting the virus and where there's high levels of scarcity, first come, first serve can be a problem for the reasons I just mentioned. And we've seen some of these concerns in the New York area and in other countries where the problem is really bad or was really bad, like in Italy. Okay, so now let's turn to the second moral principle. The second moral principle is one that favors the worst off in society. Now, John Rawls is most famous for developing a theory of justice, which is based on favoring the worst off in society. And so this principle tries to apply that idea in the context of scarce medical interventions. So first, we might give priority to the sickest. This is sometimes called the rule of rescue. Now, the problem with this view is similar to one we've seen before. If we help the sickest first, we might ignore those people who would benefit more from the medical intervention than those who are sick. If we help somebody who only lives a month longer when we could have helped somebody who would given them 10 more years of life, right? It seems we should do the second rather than the first. And some people have recognized this problem and they'll say, well, we'll only help the sickest if we know that they have a good chance of recovery. But that doesn't really solve the problem, because in this case, doctors or people, patients themselves will lie about their prognosis, and they'll say, oh, well, if I get this treatment, I'll really live 10 years longer, when really they won't. So we don't really address the problem in practice by saying only the sickest will receive medical treatment if it looks like they're going to do well by that medical treatment. Another interesting problem with this view is that if you focus on the sickest first, you're ignoring, or you can ignore, that in the future some people might end up sicker than one person is right now. So if you say at time T1 we're going to treat the sickest first because our policy is to treat the sickest first, but you might, in doing that, you might forego helping somebody at time T2 who would have been sicker than the person at time T1. So if your goal is to help the sickest first, and you won't take in the time consideration in which some people in the future might be sicker than some people in the present. Again, this is a moral principle that operates in emergency rooms at times, right? So we want to help the sickest first. But again, and this is what New York was doing too. But again, when you have scarce medical treatments, right, it's not clear that you should help the sickest first. Maybe somebody's going to die even if we help them. So in a case where there's not enough medical resources to go around, you should probably help you should move on from that person, even though they're the sickest, to help somebody who has a better chance at recovery. Now, a second way to give priority to the worst off in society is not to focus on the sickest, but the youngest. The youngest might be said to be not as well off as others, in the sense that they've lived the shortest amount of years they've had the least amount of years of life. And so you might think, well, they haven't lived a full life, so we should help them first. Now, the problem is that we don't necessarily think that it's better to help people with the least amount of years of living than people with more amount of years of living. Reflect on your intuitions on whether it's better to save a 2-month-old or a 20-year-old. If one has to die, which would you prefer to die? I think the intuition is it's preferable that the 2-month-old dies, because the 2-month-old hasn't yet developed a personality or a sense of who they are in the world, while the 20-year-old has already developed a personality and goals and visions. And we think that might be more valuable than the infant who has not yet been able to develop those capacities. So now we come to the third principle, one that we've already seen, and this is the utilitarian principle, the maximization of benefits. So you might think the way we should allocate scarce resources is through the maximization of benefits. Now, there are two different benefits we might think we ought to maximize. One is the total number of lives saved, and the other is the total amount of life years added to groups or individuals. Let's consider the first, maximum number of lives saved. This seems intuitive, this sounds the right way to think about things, but the problem with this view is that it doesn't seem that each life that's saved should be given equal weight in savings. For the example I just said, it's not clear, or it seems that saving the 2-month-old infant is not the same as saving the 20-year-old. They're both important, of course, but we think that the second is more important than the first. But that might be a clear case, but when we start thinking about the multiple lives we're going to save, it's not clear how to make certain balances. For example, suppose we have the option of giving a vaccine to one 20-year-old or 3 60-year-olds. Let's say the 20-year-old requires more of the vaccine. Older people don't. Would you prefer saving one 20-year-old to 3 60-year-olds, or would you prefer to save 3 60-year-olds to one 20-year-old? It's not clear which is the right one. The principle tells you save the most number of lives. Okay, so maybe you want to save the 3 60-year-olds, but now suppose you have 3 70-year-olds, 3 80-year-olds. Should we save those three, or should we save the life of one 20-year-old? It's not clear. So now the second principle of maximization might aim to maximize not the total number of lives, but the total number of life years that will be lived. So on this view, people with a poor chance of living many life years after receiving medical treatment are given least priority or lesser priority than those who have a higher chance of more life years. Now, there is one problem with this view. It doesn't seem that life years are equal among different persons. So if we can give a medical intervention that'll add if we can give a medical intervention that'll say add 10 life years to two different people, would it be more just to give those 10 life years to a rich person who's already lived a very decent life, or would it be more just to give those 10 life years to a poor person who's had a really bad life that's not really any fault of their own? It seems that justice would require giving the life years to the poor person who's had an unfortunate life. So again, there's this problem of weighting how important life years are to the, or how important the benefits are to different people in society. So it's not clear how we should weight, which it's not clear how we should weight the benefits that are given to different people. Again, it seems more important to give more life years to younger people than it does to older people. So now we move on to principle 4, and this principle is aimed at either encouraging the system of social cooperation or rewarding those who have benefited the system of social cooperation. So let's consider the first way. Let's say we're concerned about the system, the social system as a whole, and we want to encourage those who benefit or promote the system, right? We want people to make the system better. And so the people who would give great contributions to the system, we don't want to lose them. So how might we allocate resources on this principle? Well, what we can do is we can give priority to those who are most important to the social system. So giving medical treatments to first responders or medical workers who can save other lives is one way to prioritize those who strengthen or stabilize the system of cooperation. But another way is to help political leaders or legislators or other people who are important in the community. We might want to save their lives in order to ensure that the system of social cooperation is able to handle the scarcity of medical interventions, but maybe other important things in society as well. Now, of course, this seems like an important consideration, but we have to note that it's not a sufficient justification to say we want to prioritize the people who are important to the social system because the social system is important in itself. Right? The social system is not important in itself, but the social system is important, for example, because it makes people's lives better, or maybe because it maximizes benefits, or maybe because the social system treats everybody as equals, and so on and so forth. So the idea here is that if you say we should encourage those people who strengthen the social system, the moral justification doesn't depend on the social system itself, but it depends on the benefits or the moral goods that the social system gives you. So then you have to rely on another moral principle, for example, utilitarianism or fairness or so on and so forth. So although this is important, we have to realize that it depends on other moral principles. So another way to think about the social system and allocating scarce resources is to reward people who in the past have made sacrifices or who have contributed in important ways to the social system. So you might give priority to, let's say, first responders who've put their life on the line in helping people with the virus. And when they themselves contract the virus, we might think for the reasons that they made that sacrifice, we should help them. And I think this principle embodies the basic idea of fairness. That is, those who paid the price so we can benefit should now receive some benefit while we pay the price. That is, the foregoing of scarce medical interventions. Now, one problem with this view, although it makes it a good point, is that this kind of system would be difficult to implement in practice because people would claim that, maybe you don't have to be a first responder to be eligible for priority, but maybe you're a politician, maybe you're an important CEO, maybe you're, a community leader. So different people would claim to be important, and then we'd have to first find out if they were making true statements. Are they really important, or are they just lying so that they can get scarce medical treatment? And two, we'd have to judge whether what they actually do is an important consideration or an important function in maintaining the system of cooperation. It's not clear how we're going to figure that out. Okay, so I've just went through 4 principles and some problems we might encounter when thinking about how to use those principles for allocating scarce medical resources. Now, in the paper, the authors looked at examples of medical systems that use these principles, use other principles, and they show some flaws and some good things about using the principles in this way. But I don't want to talk about that right now. I want to go back to our case of the pandemic. And I want to point out that these principles, although they're meant to tell us what's morally important inside the setting of people who need medical treatment and there's not enough to go around, of course, we can see how these principles apply outside of that narrow setting and apply to society or the country as a whole. So, for example, the economic harms, as I mentioned earlier, that are caused by social distancing policies, they're inevitably, you're going to have to realize that, because you have to realize that these harms are going to cause increased poverty for people who are already poor. They're going to cause greater homelessness. They're going to cause greater mental illness, and they're going to cause people getting diseases that they otherwise wouldn't have. And we should expect more deaths we should expect deaths that wouldn't have happened to now happen because of these policies. That is, they're going to be shorter lifespans. Moreover, people are going to suffer really bad because of economic harms they face. And when you have these kinds of cases, you have greater rates of suicide. So we should just expect that these policies are causing death among poor people, or people who don't have a lot of room to mitigate these harms. And so, following the principles above, we might ask whether the social distancing policies, if we assume that these policies, the majority of lives they're going to save are the elderly, we might ask if saving the lives of the elderly can justify the harms to the young, justify the harms to the younger people who are going to experience them as a result of the social distancing policies. It's not clear that they are justified. Or maybe the lives we'll save by enacting these social distancing policies, of course, they save a very small percentage of the total amount of people in society, but the total amount of people in society are going to experience very significant harms. Is it just to save the few to impose harms on many? Or we might ask whether it's fair or not to save those who are at high risk of dying from the coronavirus, but when they're high risk because they've made themselves high risk by living unhealthy lifestyle choices of their own, right? Maybe we might think, well, why should I have to pay for their lack of responsibility of taking care of themselves when I did my part and take care of myself? So those are some considerations that apply the principles that we just talked about outside of the context of scarce medical interventions, and applied it to the problem of whether to try to save the lives that require imposing harms on everybody. But we might also think about the issues that we discussed in our unit in political philosophy and the unit in moral philosophy. So when we consider the theories of political philosophy that we discussed, right, we realized that we saw that citizens have duties to other citizens. So maybe citizens have a duty to protect those most vulnerable to this virus, the elderly and those with underlying medical conditions. We have a duty to protect them, maybe because they're the worst off. Maybe these people have contributed to society, and they deserve our sacrifice. So, as citizens in a democracy, maybe we have a duty to take care of them. But we might also think about Hobbes and Locke, how we can use their ideas to think about the benefits and costs to the social distancing policies. So look, the longer you keep imposing these harms on people, the more and more they're going to resist it, and the less and less they're going to accept it. But if the government is doing something people don't like, people get a little upset and they'll show that frustration. These frustrations can lead into violent protest. They can lead to riots. They can lead to the kind of thing we saw with the LA riots. Now, whether there's a high likelihood of that or not is an important question. But it's clear that these things can happen. So as you get closer to the frustration mounting and people's economic situations getting worse and worse, the chance of leading into that kind of social instability becomes higher and higher, and then you risk going into a state of war. So maybe there's a Hobbesian reason to think that, at some point we can't keep imposing harms on everybody because that risks going into a state of war. Or maybe if you think about Locke's conception of a government as protecting the lives of everybody in society, you might think, well, the government has the authority to do what it thinks is best, so long as it actually protects the lives of everybody. But of course, for Locke, if at some point the government is not doing a good job at protecting lives, citizens have a right to get rid of their governments. So again, Locke and Hobbes, their general political theories can be used to think about the government's response to this pandemic. And of course, we might even broaden it out to moral theories in general. We've already seen how utilitarian calculations can be used to think about the harms imposed by the social distancing policies, right? Is the greater good served by just letting the virus spread and letting, people die? Or is the greater good achieved by saving as many lives as we can, even if we impose harms on most people? It's not clear. So if you're a utilitarian, you kind of have to figure out why you value one policy over another. But if we think about Kant's moral philosophy, at least on the third formulation of the categorical imperative, right? Kant says we have a duty to treat people as ends in themselves. The most vulnerable in society, they're people, they're persons, they're ends in themselves, and so we should do whatever we can to save them. Of course, we have to realize that we shouldn't be required to kill ourselves to save somebody else. But maybe the harms that spread across society, maybe they're not as dire as the harms of facing death with the coronavirus. So maybe treating people as ends in themselves requires that we bear these harms. Hopefully, I've framed the current situation of the pandemic in a way where you can see how the political and moral theories that we've discussed come into play. Hopefully, I framed the question about the justification of social distancing policies in a way where you can use the theories that we've discussed, whether they're in the Unit on Morality, the Unit on Political Philosophy, or even the principles outlined in this reading. Hopefully you can use those theories to get at the question of whether the social distancing requirements are morally justified. But in any case, we'll discuss it more in class on Monday, and I will send out a list of medium paper questions for you in the next day or so. So I hope you have a good week.